All right, diving right in. Today, we're going deep on database security and user management, too.
Yeah, absolutely crucial stuff for anyone working with data.
Especially if you're even a little bit worried about keeping sensitive information, well, sensitive.
Yeah, no kidding.
This deep dive should give you a good, solid foundation.
For sure.
And we've been digging into some really interesting material.
Yeah, a fantastic resource all about SQL mastery. It's really practical,
Yeah, very hands-on. So that translates really well into like actionable takeaways,
Absolutely,
which is what we're all about here.
for sure. Making things clear and applicable.
Exactly. So today's mission,
Yeah, weigh it on us.
we're going to extract the core principles and practical steps
Okay.
for securing your database and managing who has access to it.
That was good.
And by the end, you should walk away feeling empowered to, protect your data.
That's
Not
right.
overwhelmed, hopeful.
Keep it digestible.
Right. So let's just start with the basics. What even is database security when we say that?
Yeah, so in a nutshell,
What are we talking about?
database security is all about protecting your database from, well, anything unwanted, right?
Okay.
Like unauthorized access,
Yeah.
people snooping around where they shouldn't be,
Okay.
data breaches,
Uh-huh.
and really any other threats that could mess with your data,
Gotcha.
like could compromise its integrity or its confidentiality.
So basically, like you're building a digital vault for your data.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like Fort Knox for your data.
What are the like key components? What makes that vault secure?
Well, it's multi-layered, right?
Yeah.
You got different layers of protection.
Okay.
So first up, you have authentication, and that's all about verifying who people are.
Okay, so confirming they are who they say they are.
Exactly.
Okay.
Making sure they're not imposters.
Right, right.
Next, you've got authorization,
Okay.
which controls what authenticated users can actually do in the database.
Okay, so they're in the door, but what can they do once they're in the...
Exactly. It's like, can they just view certain tables or can they modify stuff?
Gotcha, gotcha. So like showing your ID at the door and then getting a backstage pass that only lets you into certain areas.
Yeah, perfect analogy.
What else? What other big pieces are there?
Well, encryption is a huge one.
Okay.
Encryption's basically scrambling your data, so even if someone gets in, they can't read it without the key.
So it's like a secret code
Exactly.
that only the right people have the decoder ring for?
Yeah, and this applies both to data sitting in the database,
Okay.
at rest,
Uh-huh.
and when it's moving between systems, like in transit.
Gotcha, gotcha. So both when it's just hanging out and when it's on the move.
Yep, got to protect it everywhere.
Makes sense. What else?
And then last but not least, auditing is super important.
Okay, what's that?
Think of it like security cameras for your database.
Okay.
It logs all the activities,
Oh, okay.
so you can track who did what and when.
Okay, so you can go back and see if anything fishy happened.
Exactly, like a detective's case file.
Gotcha. So it's not just about, like, the fancy tech then, right?
No, definitely not. While those technical safeguards are essential,
Yeah.
you also need solid policies and practices,
Okay.
like keeping those security protocols updated
Yeah.
and training users on what not to do,
Right. So the human element's still a big factor.
Oh, absolutely. Human error can be a huge vulnerability.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, so we've got the big picture.
Big picture, yeah.
Now let's get into how to actually control who can even get into the database in the first place.
All right, let's talk user management.
User management. So how do we create and manage these users?
Well, user management covers creating those new user accounts,
Okay.
modifying existing ones,
Uh-huh.
and deleting them when they're not needed anymore.
Right, right.
And luckily, SQL has specific commands for each of these tasks.
Okay, give me the magic words.
All right, so to create a new user, you would use the create user command.
Create user. Okay.
And the format goes like this. Create user at localhost identified by password.
All right, break that down for me.
Sure. So this creates a user, we'll call them newser,
Okay.
who can only connect from the local machine.
Okay.
That's what the localhost part means.
So that means the machine where the database itself is actually running.
Exactly. And then, of course, we assign them a password.
Makes sense. Now, what if we wanted to be a little more flexible
Okay.
and allow connections, say, from a specific remote server?
Good question. In that case, you'd just swap out localhost with the server's IP address
Okay.
or its host name.
Gotcha.
So, for instance, newser at 192.168.1.100 would only let that specific IP address connect.
Okay, so it's pretty customizable.
Yeah. Now, you could also use set% to allow connections from any host.
Okay.
But for security reasons, we generally don't recommend that.
Yeah, that sounds like opening the door pretty wide.
Exactly. Better to be safe than sorry.
All right, so we've got our user created. What if they forget their password?
Happens all the time.
Or we need to update it, just for security's sake.
Absolutely. In those cases, you'd use the alter user command,
Alter user.
which
Okay.
looks a lot like create user.
Okay.
Like this, alter user at localhost identified by new password.
Okay, so we just swap out the old password with the new one.
Yeah, pretty straightforward.
And if someone leaves the project or no longer needs access?
Then it's time to say goodbye with the drop user command.
Drop user. Okay.
This one's simple. Drop user at localhost.
Poof, gone.
Exactly. Cleans up the system nicely.
Now, if we need to see all the users in our database,
Yeah, if you want a quick overview,
what's the command for that?
you'd use select user host from mysql.user.
Okay, so that gives us a list of everyone who can potentially get in.
Yep, usernames and their associated hosts all laid out for you.
Okay, these commands all seem pretty user-friendly, actually.
Yeah, SQL's designed to be readable.
What's a key takeaway here when we're actually creating these users?
Oh, absolutely. Make sure to use strong passwords.
Okay, strong passwords.
Unique for each user.
Gotcha.
And definitely avoid those default accounts that sometimes come with the database system.
Default accounts. Okay.
Yeah, those are like low-hanging fruit for attackers.
So like leaving the keys under the doormat, basically.
Exactly. Bad idea.
All right, so we've got users in the system, but just having an account doesn't mean they can do everything, right?
Right. Just like having a library card doesn't give you access to the restricted archives.
Exactly. So that's where permissions come in, I guess.
Exactly. Permissions define what each user can do within the database.
Okay.
Like, can they read the data, modify it, create new tables,
Okay.
even manage other users, though that's usually restricted.
So how do we actually grant and revoke these permissions?
Well, SQL uses grant and revoke for that.
Okay, grant and revoke.
Yeah. So for granting specific permissions, you use the grant command,
Okay.
followed by a list of what you want to allow,
Hmm.
then the database objects it applies to, and finally the user.
Okay, so it's like you can do this to that data.
Exactly. So for instance, grant select insert update on database name to user at localhost would give user permission to select, insert, and update data in all the tables within database name.
Okay, so they can read, add, and change data in that specific database.
Yep. And if you need to take away those permissions,
Uh-huh.
use the revoke command.
Revoke, okay.
Very similar structure to grant.
All right.
So something like revoke, insert, update on database name from user at localhost would remove those insert and update permissions from user.
Gotcha. So they can only read the data now.
Exactly.
And if we want to see what permissions someone currently has.
You can use the command show grants for user at localhost.
Okay, so that gives us a little report of their access level.
Yep, all laid out for you.
Now, when we're deciding what permissions to give, is there like a guiding principle we should be following?
Oh, absolutely. The principle of least privilege is key here.
Least privilege. Oh.
It means you only grant the bare minimum permissions a user needs to do their job.
And why is that so important?
Well, imagine if someone with broad admin rights gets compromised.
Whoa.
They can wreak havoc.
Yeah.
But if that same compromised account only had access to, say, updating customer addresses,
Okay.
the damage is much more contained.
Gotcha.
It's like giving someone a key to just the front door,
Yeah.
not the master key ring to the whole house.
Right. So limit the potential damage if something goes wrong.
Exactly. Minimize the blast radius.
All right, that makes perfect sense. Now, managing all these permissions for, if you've got a lot of users,
Yeah, it can get messy.
it sounds like it could get pretty complicated.
Oh, it can.
Mm-hmm.
Which is where roles and role-based access control come in.
Roles, okay.
Yeah. Roles are basically groups of permissions.
Okay.
So instead of assigning the same set of permissions to each user individually,
Okay.
you group them in a role
Mhm.
and then assign that role to the users.
Okay, so it's like creating a job title with a set of responsibilities.
Exactly, like data analyst or customer support.
Okay, that sounds much more efficient. What are the commands for this role magic?
Well, to create a new role, you use create role followed by the name,
Okay.
like create role read-only.
All right, and then to actually give those roles some permissions.
It's similar to giving permissions to a user. Grant select on database name to read-only.
Okay, so now that role can select data,
Exactly.
and then to give that role to a specific user.
You use grant again, but this time you're granting the role to the user. Grant read-only to user at localhost.
Okay, so now user has all the permissions associated with that role.
Exactly. And sometimes they might need to activate that role using set role read-only.
Interesting. So they have to sort of put on their read-only hat before they can actually use those permissions.
Yeah, in some cases, depending on the database system.
So if we have a team of analysts, say,
Okay.
who all need to read data from certain tables but not change anything.
Perfect example. You just create that data analyst role once
Uh-huh.
and then assign it to each of them.
That's way more efficient than doing it one by one.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Especially in larger organizations, it saves a ton of time and hassle.
Makes sense. Okay, so we've controlled who can get in and what they can do once they're there.
Right. 2 big layers of protection.
But what about protecting the data itself? Like, even if someone somehow gets past those access controls.
That's where encryption comes in, the heavy hitter.
Encryption.
Encryption scrambles that data, so it's unreadable without the key.
Right, the secret decoder ring.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we need to think about both when the data is stored in the database,
Okay, at rest.
yep, at rest,
Mm.
and when it's being transmitted in transit.
Gotcha. So let's tackle at rest first. What are the common approaches there?
Well, one very common one is called transparent data encryption, or TDE.
TDE. Okay.
Many modern databases use this.
Okay.
It basically scrambles all the data files on your storage disk.
Okay.
And the transparent part means it happens behind the scenes.
So applications don't even need to know it's happening.
Exactly. It's like magic.
Okay. Now, what about when data's moving around in transit?
For that, we typically use SSLTLS.
SLTLS. Okay. What's that stand for, by the way?
It's Secure Sockets Layer Transport Layer Security.
Okay, that's a mouthful.
It is. But basically, it creates this secure, encrypted tunnel for information traveling between your database and, say, the applications accessing it.
Okay, so like a VPN for your data?
Kind of, yeah. It makes eavesdropping really difficult.
So the data's protected while it's moving from one place to another?
Exactly. And you can usually configure your database server to require SSL/TLS connections for certain users,
Okay.
or even for all connections, which is the most secure.
Gotcha. So the key takeaway here?
Always encrypt sensitive data,
Always.
no matter where it is or where it's going.
Things like passwords, credit card numbers, social security numbers, that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. Those are non-negotiables.
All right, so we've got access controls, we've got encryption. Now, even with all that, it's still important to know what's going on inside our database, right? Like, to have some eyes on the inside.
Oh, for sure. That's where auditing and monitoring come in.
Auditing and monitoring. Okay, so tell me about auditing first.
Auditing is all about keeping a record of what's happening in the database.
Right.
Like who's accessing what data, when they're doing it, if any changes are made.
So like a detailed log?
Exactly. It's like a security camera recording, but for your data.
And what about monitoring?
Monitoring is more real-time, keeping an eye on things as they happen,
Okay.
watching for performance issues, anything unusual, any potential threats.
Gotcha. So how do we actually set up auditing?
Most database systems have built-in features or plugins for that.
Okay.
For example, MySQL has an audit log plugin you can enable.
Okay.
The command to install it would be something like install plugin, audit log, suname, auditlog.co.
Yeah.
Once that's running, it starts recording events to an audit log.
Gotcha. And then SQL Server has its own auditing feature too.
Yep, SQL Server audit.
And we get to choose which events we want to track.
Right. You can decide if you want to log things like login attempts, data modifications, admin actions.
Okay, so we can customize it to our needs.
Yep. Tailor it to what's most important for your security.
Now, how do we actually look at these logs, see what's been recorded?
Well, in MySQL, once the audit log plugin is active,
Okay.
you can just query the mysql.auditlog table.
Mm-hmm.
Select from mysql.auditlog.
Okay, so we can see all the recorded events.
Other database systems will have their own ways to access these logs,
Uh-huh.
often through their management tool.
Gotcha. And for monitoring, what kind of tools do people usually use?
There are a few options.
Mm-hmm.
Many database management tools like MySQL Workbench,
Okay.
pgadmin for PostgreSQL, SQL Server Management Studio, they all have built-in monitoring capabilities.
Okay.
You can track performance, see active sessions, even set up alerts sometimes.
So those are good starting points.
Yeah, they give you a good overview. And then there are dedicated monitoring solutions from various companies. Those offer more advanced features like anomaly detection or predictive analysis.
Gotcha. So you can get it as fancy as you need to.
Exactly. It depends on your security needs and budget.
All right, so the advice here is turn on auditing, check those logs regularly, and use monitoring tools to keep an eye on things.
Definitely. And set up alerts for any unusual activity.
Okay, alerts, like what kind of things?
Oh, like a sudden spike in failed logins?
Okay.
Or attempts to access sensitive data without authorization.
Gotcha, gotcha. So that we can react quickly if something's up.
Exactly. Early detection is key.
All right, we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have, from the foundations to some pretty advanced stuff.
To really help solidify all this, can we walk through a practical example, like how these concepts might be applied in the real world?
Absolutely. Let's say you're managing the database for an online store.
Okay, online store. Familiar territory.
Right. You'll have different users with different needs.
Yeah, for sure.
You might have analysts who need to generate reports, but they shouldn't be able to change any data.
Okay, read-only access for them.
Exactly. So you create a user just for that. Create user reproducer at localhost, identified by secure password.
Okay, there's our create user command.
And then grant them only select privileges on the database.
Mm-hmm.
Grant select on store to reproducer at localhost.
All right, so they can see the data, but not touch it.
Perfect. Least privilege in action.
Now, what about someone who needs to, say, enter new orders into the system?
Okay, so for them, you might create a data entry role.
Okay.
Give it permissions to insert and update data in the orders table.
Uh-huh.
So first, create the role. Create role, date entry.
Create role.
Then grant those permissions. Grant insert update on store.orders to data entry.
Okay, so that role can add new orders and modify existing ones.
Exactly. And then you create individual users for your data entry team
Mm-hmm.
and assign them this role. Grant date entry to datehouser at localhost.
Gotcha, gotcha. Makes sense.
Now, what about sensitive customer data like credit card numbers?
Oh, yeah, that's super important to protect.
Definitely. You'd want to encrypt that column in your customers table.
Okay.
Something like alter table customers, modify column credit card number, varchar 255 encrypted.
Okay, so even if someone got access to the database, they couldn't read those numbers without the decryption key.
Exactly. That data is locked down tight.
These examples are really helpful to see how it all comes together in practice.
Yeah, it's good to see it in action.
Now, for those listeners who are maybe thinking about job interviews,
Okay, career advancement.
let's talk about some common interview questions around database security and user management.
Great idea. Let's run through a few, and not just the answers, but why they're asking.
Okay, that's helpful.
Because sometimes the why is more important than the what.
All right, first one. What is database security and why is it important?
So database security is all about protecting your data, unauthorized access, integrity, confidentiality.
Okay, the big picture.
Right. They want to see if you understand the scope.
Okay.
And it's important because databases often hold sensitive information. Breaches can be really costly financially and reputationally.
Yeah, huge legal liabilities too.
Absolutely. So they want to see that you get the gravity of it.
Okay, next question. How do you create a new database user?
That's your basic create user command. Create user neuser at localhost, identified by password.
Straightforward. They're checking if you know the fundamentals.
Exactly. If you can't do that, you're in trouble.
All right, next one. How do you grant permissions to a user?
Grant command, specifying permissions and the database objects. Grant select, insert on database name, to neuser at localhost.
So, can you actually give people access?
Yep. This is a practical skill they want to see.
What is the principle of least privilege?
That's about only giving the minimum access necessary for someone to do their job.
Right, we talked about that. So, are you security-minded?
Exactly. Do you understand best practices?
Okay, good to know. How do you revoke permissions from a user?
Revoke command. Revoke insert on database name from neuser at localhost.
Okay, can you take away access when you need to?
Yep. It's all about control.
What is a role, and how does it simplify user management?
A role is a collection of permissions that can be assigned to multiple users.
Okay.
Makes managing permissions much easier, especially at scale.
Okay, so can you think about efficiency and scalability?
Exactly. That's what they're looking for.
How do you encrypt data at rest in a database?
You can use features like TDE or column-level encryption.
Do you know about data protection techniques?
That's the key here. They want to see if you're thinking about data security.
Okay, good to know. How do you encrypt data in transit?
SSLTLS for that, encrypting the communication channel.
Okay, protecting data on the move.
Yep, keeping it safe from prying eyes.
What is database auditing and why is it important?
Auditing is tracking and logging activities in the database.
Okay.
Important for security, compliance, and investigations.
So are you thinking about accountability and traceability?
Absolutely. Auditing is key for that.
How do you enable auditing in MySQL?
Install and enable the audit log plugin. Install, plugin audit log, so name, auditlog.so.
Okay, can you actually do it?
They might even ask you to demonstrate.
How do you view user permissions in MySQL?
Show grants for command. Show grants for user at localhost.
Okay, so check exactly what someone can do.
Yeah. Essential for managing access.
What is the difference between authentication and authorization?
Authentication verifies who you are. Authorization determines what you can do.
Ah, right. Two sides of the same coin.
Exactly. They want to make sure you understand that distinction.
How do you create a read-only user?
Create the user, then grant only select privileges. Create user reducer at localhost, identified by password, and then grant select on database name. To reducer at localhost.
Okay, practical application again.
Right. They want to see you can put it into practice.
How do you monitor database activity?
Use database monitoring tools to track performance and potential threats.
Okay, so being proactive about security.
Exactly. It's not just about reacting, it's about preventing.
And finally, what are some best practices for database security?
Strong passwords, encryption, least privilege, audit logs, keeping everything patched and up to date.
Okay, so the big picture stuff again.
Right. They want to see if you can summarize the key points.
Those interview questions are really helpful.
Yeah, good practice.
Now let's switch gears a bit.
Okay.
Let's talk about some practical scenarios
All right, game time.
where you'd need to apply all this knowledge.
Love it. Let's put it all together.
Okay, first scenario. How would you create a user with read-only access to a database called reports?
Easy one. SOCL create user reducer at localhost, identified by password. Grant select on reports to reducer at localhost.
Okay, so they can read everything in that database, but that's it.
Exactly. No modifying or deleting anything.
Scenario 2. We've got a customers table with a column called sensitive info that needs to be encrypted. How would you do that?
Again, the exact command depends on the database system.
Okay.
But in MySQL, you could use something like this. SQL pencil, alter table customers, modify column sensitive info, varchar 255, encrypted.
Okay, so we're modifying that specific column.
Yep. Making sure that sensitive data is protected, even if someone gets unauthorized access to the table.
These scenarios are really helpful to connect the dots.
Yeah, it's all about understanding how these concepts work in a real-world setting.
All right, well, I think that about covers it for our deep dive on database security and user management.
We went deep.
We talked about what database security actually is, how to manage users, create them, modify them, delete them.
Yeah, a lot of ground covered.
And then the whole world of permissions.
Granting, revoking, the principle of least privilege, all that good stuff.
And then, of course, encryption at rest and in transit.
Keeping that data safe and sound.
And then the importance of auditing and monitoring.
Always got to have eyes on the inside.
And we even saw how all of this would actually be applied in an online store.
Real-world applications are key.
And tackled some common interview questions, too.
Hopefully that helps some folks out there.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess looking ahead, what's another area of data protection that we could explore?
Well, backup and recovery is a natural next step.
Okay, backup and recovery.
Yeah, because even with all these precautions, sometimes things go wrong.
Right, right. So having a plan B is crucial.
Absolutely. You got to be prepared to restore your data if something happens.
All right, well, that's definitely something to think about for a future deep dive.
Definitely a topic worth exploring.
Well, for those listening, if you have any questions about what we covered today,
Or any other topics you'd like us to tackle.
yeah, feel free to reach out.
We love hearing from you.
And as you go forward, think about how all of these principles apply to your own projects.
Yeah, what are your specific needs?
What are your vulnerabilities?
And what features does your database system offer?
Because there's always more to learn about database security.
Absolutely. It's a constantly evolving field.
So stay curious and stay safe out there.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
All right, thanks for joining us for another deep dive.
Until next time,
See ya.
take care.
Bye.